So a provider is basically a component that you can use to wrap around other components and make data globally accessible to those components. So what do I mean by that? Right here I have an example of this button group component, and under the hood, if I go into this button group component right here, which is this file, you can see that I'm actually doing exactly that. I'm taking this button group provider that I've created, and I'm passing this value object that has all of this data that I want to be accessible to all of the uh, child components of this group component. So when I say child components, I'm saying all of the components that are inside of this opening and closing button group tag right here. So all of these components, just assume that div is like a custom component or something like that. Everything inside of this button group will now have access to this value object here, as long as these child components are consuming that context, which I'll get into briefly. So essentially, if I didn't use a provider for this example, then I would have to manually pass all of the properties that I'm passing to this button group component to all of the child components. So if I wasn't using a provider, this onClick property right here, I would actually have to copy and paste and put that into all of my child components as well, which would be a very big hassle. It would get messy very quickly, and it wouldn't be very maintainable. So, gonna get rid of that real quick. So that's one example of why you would want to use a provider, is to not only avoid prop drilling, but also avoid prop replicating, where you're kind of repeating the same props over and over again through all of your child components. So let's go into the button group file again. So at the very top, I'm importing this button group provider from providers slash button group provider. So this file right here is located in my providers folder, which I just think it's neat to have a providers folder. It makes things a bit more organized. And all of the providers inside of the providers folder are pretty much going to look the exact same because they're usually created in the exact same way. It's a pretty simple concept. So if I go to this button group provider file here, you can see that all we're doing is creating a context, which we're importing from React. We're exporting a function that just uses that context. In other words, it's essentially you're creating like this global object to store all of your shared data in, and then you're exporting a function that returns that data. So whenever you want to request it, like if a child component wants to get data from its provider, then it would use this use button group context function, and this will give that child component back that value data from the parent provider. This next thing that we're exporting is the actual provider component itself. This is what we actually use to wrap all of the components that we're trying to distribute data to inside of. So that's why inside of our button group file, I'm importing the actual button group provider component right here, which is this, and I'm wrapping all of the children that I want to have access to this value object around that. So let's go ahead and go to an example of accessing this data. So if I go back to the example here, you can see I have this button.member component, and I want this button.member component to have access to this property right here in the button group component. So in order to do that, I need to go ahead and go into the button member component, which is this file right here. And if I scroll to the top, you can see I'm still importing from this button group provider file, but I'm accessing the use button group context instead of the button group provider component, because we don't need that here, because we're trying to use that context. We're trying to get the value data from the provider, not create a provider. So I'm importing this use button group context, and all I have to do is just call it, because this is a function that we're returning. So once I call this function, then it's going to go ahead and return all of, or essentially just this big value object right here. So that's how we access this value object, is by calling this use context hook that we have. And so once I call that, then I'm just free to access all of the data that's inside of that object. You can see here I'm accessing things like onSelect, onClick, onUnselect. If I go to the group, you can see I have onSelect, onClick, onUnselect. So it directly corresponds to this object right here. And then I'm just free to do whatever I want with that data once I have it. So the overall big picture premise is pretty simple. It takes some time to get used to executing it, which is, like, makes total sense. So I want to go ahead and now go over an example of actually doing this from scratch, because obviously this is a pre-made template that I have. So we're going to go ahead and first create a provider, and I'm going to do this inside of the actual project that we're working on. So I removed all of the code, and I'm just going to walk through how you would create it from scratch, basically. So one thing that I really like doing at the beginning of a project is making a app provider, which is essentially just going to be a provider that I put at the very top level of our project. And so it will essentially wrap around all components in our project and make some data globally accessible to all of those components. Because sometimes you just want to have some kind of data that every component should be able to have access to. Like, for example, any given component at any given time may want to know what page you're on, like what URL you're currently on your website. And so you could pass that data through your global app provider at the top level, and then every child component will have access to information about what page the user is currently on. So I'm going to go ahead and go inside of our app provider here, and to actually create a provider, you just want to import create context and use context from React. And the very first thing you're going to do is create a new instance of a context. So you're going to say, in this case, I'm calling it app context, because this is for our global app. So I'm going to say app context equals create context. And I believe TypeScript is just complaining because it doesn't like when you don't pass an argument here if one is required, so I'm just going to put undefined. You don't have to do this if you don't want to. This shouldn't error, at least not for us yet, because we disabled strict mode in TypeScript. But if we had strict mode enabled, then this would throw a type error. But so for now, I'm just going to throw undefined in here to get rid of that underline. And then the next thing we're going to do is export a function for using that context. So I'm going to call it use app context. And this function is just going to call use context. And the context that we're going to be using or consuming is the app context object that we created. Alright, and then so this is going to be the function that our child components call when we want to actually access the shared value that we're creating in our provider. So the next thing we're going to create is our actual provider component. So I'm going to say const, or actually we can go ahead and shortcut this with RSC, and then just delete this. So const app provider, we are going to destructure two things from our props object. One is going to be the children, and the other is going to be the value prop that we pass. And we can get rid of this div here, and we're just going to replace this with our actual provider component that React gives us, which we can access by referencing this app context that we created. And we're going to say app context dot provider, and then we're going to pass to that the value object that we're passing here to this component. So this app provider component right here is essentially just a middleman to essentially do this. So we actually really don't have to export this component or create this component, but it just makes it a little bit easier, and we don't have to we can just kind of shortcut instead of saying app context.provider. And we can just shorten it to saying app provider in our actual code. So this is essentially just a shortcut that we're creating right now. Make life a little bit easier. And then so inside of our provider, we're just going to put all of the children that we have inside of this app provider component right here, nested inside of our provider component. So now all of these children will have access to this value object. And that's pretty much it. This is essentially what all of your provider files are going to look like. It's pretty straightforward. It'll take some time to get used to, obviously, and kind of messing around with to see, you know, exactly how all of your data is getting shuffled around. But yeah, so that's it for the actual provider file. Now we can go inside of our app.tsx, and we're going to want to import the app provider component that we just created. So this right here is what we're importing. And this global component, or I guess root component, is essentially, this represents all of the components inside of our application. So we're going to wrap our app provider around all of our project components. So we're going to say app provider. And we're just going to put this root component inside of our provider. And then we're just going to pass a value prop, which currently we don't have any data that we're passing to it, but I'll go ahead and just put in a few pieces of dummy data, I guess. So we can say like test1 equal to some test data, and we'll just leave it at that for now. So this would be actually like how you would create a new provider and wrap it around some child components that you want to share that data with. And then inside of our child components, again, to consume or access this value object, let's go to our home page real quick. And you can see at the top, I probably should have gotten rid of this for the example, but yeah, essentially we're going to import the use app context function from that same provider. And you can just say const app value object is equal to use app context. So we're just going to call this use app context hook, and then I'm just going to go ahead and console log app value object so that we can see that it should be exactly equal to the value object that we created inside of the app provider in our app file. So this value object directly corresponds with when we call this use app context. So that's exactly what it's going to return as the value object. So if I go to my browser and I hit inspect, and this was from last time, so ignore that, and I click refresh, then you should see that we have this object right here that's printed in the output window, which is the value object. So now I don't have to pass any kind of props down to these child components. I can just import this this use app context hook, and then that will give me this value at the top level of that directory. So that's pretty much it for providers. Hopefully that makes things a little bit easier to understand. I know that making this video definitely helped me clear up some misconceptions that I had about providers. So, yeah. Anyways, hope that helped.